Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We are very much looking forward to presenting this to you. As you can see there on the screen, the title of today's session is all about achieving operational excellence by combining NetSuite and Celigo. Before we do, though, going into the topics, let's do a bit of an intros from our side. So myself, I'm Adele. I'm the lead solutions consultant at Celigo, covering the whole of the EMEA region. For those who might not be aware, Celigo is an integration platform as a service. We will give more details of what that is as we go through the session. I am honored today to be presenting alongside my colleague David from Staria, so I'll hand over to David for an intro from his side.
Hello everybody, thanks for joining. David Atherton, I head up the UK operations for Staria, and delighted to be presenting this alongside Celigo to see how it might help some of our existing and future businesses.
Nice one, yeah, absolutely. Right then, with that done, we'll jump straight into it. So, here's something I always like to throw in before we go into the weeds, let's say. It's just something to start getting the juices flowing. This is a stat, which I'll go ahead and explain essentially what this is. Recently reading a report, the report is down there on the bottom left, the link to the report there. Essentially, this is a stat which explains between the period of 2019 to 2021, there was a 66% increase in sales across Europe online, so e-commerce essentially. Now that's nothing surprising considering it was a pandemic period. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. There's been an increase. Maybe the stats might be new, but the fact that it is quite a big number isn't really surprising. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is more so to explain what was in that report, which will then lead on to what it is we're going to be discussing today. So, among other things, the report was giving details about what were the top markets, so top industries essentially, which were selling online, and you can see them there. So fashion, in this case apparel specifically, electronics, at least from a consumer perspective, those are the two main markets. This would mean essentially companies within that space were the ones that saw the biggest increase overall in their sales. Now, given the challenges that we all know about pandemic that was all online, many businesses were not necessarily equipped with that. And one of the challenges that they had was to understand how payments would be done. Again, remember, we don't have brick and mortar stores at the time. You can't really go there unless you have a mask and whatnot, flashbacks. Anyway, so the options were really using things like digital wallets, bank transfers, or even the buy now, pay later approach, which is still very common nowadays. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up again, as I say, is just to say that this is one of the examples of the challenges that have remained and companies continue using nowadays, at least the ones that I'm speaking with, very much so, which does bring quite significant challenges in terms of getting to that operational efficiency, if you like, overall, because ultimately things have changed. Now, with that already as a seed planted in your mind to think more about what we're discussing here, moving on to the agenda then for today's session. So we'll start off with an introduction to Staria. So those who may not necessarily be aware, or just as a reminder of who Staria is and what they do, and that's where I'll hand over to David to give us details of that. We'll also then look at a high-level solutions concept, a bit of an overview of what that needs to look like, really what does the overall landscape and picture look like. Following on from that, we'll discuss a little bit about what integration strategies mean and what different options there tend to be nowadays. Naturally, then we'll move on to more information about Celigo. This is where I said we'll give more context about Celigo, what it is we do, and how we go about doing that. Of course, within the context of today's session, we'll want to explain what is, in our view at least, a look at the full customer journey in the context again of e-commerce and what points you should really be focusing on, the ones that we tend to see more often in our conversations. Beyond that, we'll then start looking at where do you go if you have already automated or at least most, if not all of it, of your order to cash process. And really, again, starting to think about where to go beyond that, what aspects to focus on, and well, where else might you be able to introduce some automations, really, in the interest of achieving operational excellence, as we said. Last but certainly not least, we'll then go into a platform showcase and a bit of a demonstration, so you can really see what this is under the cover. Right. On that note, then, to kick things off, I shall hand over to David to give us an overview of Staria.
Great, thanks, Adele. And as Adele alluded to, most of you probably know Staria, and perhaps have worked with us for some years, so it's just a good time to refresh thoughts on what Staria offers and how we're progressing our solution and services approach to our customers, just really to continually add value and support them on the growth journey. This could include our global accounting services, our fantastic BI and planning tool, Navalock, be that as a product or services around reporting. But actually, what's becoming more prevalent and important is our trusted partners who bring the extra mile to the NetSuite ecosystem. We're great believers in making tools do what they're built to do for the best practice, and then bringing in third parties that fit the specific needs of our customers. I mean, part of this comes from demands and challenges we've encountered ourselves on our growth journey. Staria has continued to expand and grow territory and number-wise, but equally our experiences across our projects with our own customers and lessons learned and trial and testing. But as with all these processes over the past 11 years in the NetSuite ecosystem, we've tested and learned from our own mistakes, and should we pick the correct solution architecture to provide robust and future-proof solution stacks and services. Good example of the type of challenge we see generally revolve around integrations, be that with Salesforce, complex billing engines, software, AP tools with OCR or without, or somewhat typical landscape distributors or retailers often face, as shown here. And these can often be done where they have a number of custom integrations, but actually the hairball, as it's often known, makes much more sense when we choose to promote an iPaaS solution such as Celigo to help us and the customer resolve these issues and gain automation. So I think that's brief introduction and reminder about obviously what we bring to the table, but a good segue to then pass this back to Adele to take it forward, how Celigo can certainly help with the commerce style of business.
Thank you for that, David. Very interesting to hear about all the different experiences that Staria has with regards to what they can do with helping customers. Now, into the topic then of where I'm going to provide more context here. As I mentioned, and as you saw from the agenda, we'll be looking here at what sort of strategies are there when it comes to automations in the form of integration in this case. Generally speaking, there are four main categories, if you can like to put them that way. Now, the first of them being a DIY, so that's the most common one, or actually I should say the second most common one, to be quite precise, whereby essentially you have people in-house, or perhaps you might hire a third party to build the integrations from scratch. Historically, it's been the most common approach. That said, it also historically has shown that it's not the most efficient way of doing things necessarily. As you can see there, there's some pros and cons of doing this. The major con being really when it comes to future-proofing, it's not the best approach to go. It might solve a problem in the interim. It might address an issue currently. It's a bit like adding a patch on top of an issue. It doesn't really go in terms of longevity. It will not necessarily prove to be the most effective way to do things. What's the most common one, and this really is the most common approach to doing it, is what's known as native, particularly with the move to the software as a service world, essentially everything being in the cloud. What vendors are doing more and more so nowadays is not necessarily a new trend, but it's certainly a continuing trend, is to start offering these native, i.e. connectors, so different systems that essentially have direct connections to them. Now, this is indeed, as I said, the most common approach. This does have its place in the market. There are certainly scenarios where it makes complete sense to use native integrations. A common one that we tend to see quite a bit is if you're integrating your tax reporting system or engine with your ERP, that makes sense to use something native. It's completely built out. It's been tried and tested within a matter of hours, if not even less than that. It's quickly to get things set up. It probably takes longer to discuss the pros and cons than actually setting up those native connections. And there's a lot of them out there. And as I say, as businesses start to expand or perhaps grow or get different requirements, then that's where you start to see a bit of the limitations, as it were, of these native connections. Now, I do know of many businesses that have a combination of strategies depending on what they're trying to do. But overall, though, there really needs to be an overarching strategy going forward, especially as businesses start to want to grow. And if you're in that space or considering going into a scenario where you are expanding, you'll definitely want to start considering, at the very least, what is going to be that strategy. Now, we've spoken about the two most common ones, as it were, to solving these direct issues, direct pain points, as they're sometimes known as well. However, when it comes to introducing an actual strategy, that's where things get a little bit different. So you've got the first one there on the left-hand side, which is essentially an integration platform, or what's known as a technical integration platform. It's one which does provide for a strategy. It does, however, require technical expertise. There is quite a steep learning curve if the people that are not necessarily experienced with it need to get to grips with it. And it really is targeted at very technical people, software developers, software engineers, such as myself. That's essentially where these platforms sit. Historically, they have been the ones that started off this move over to the cloud as well. They supported it, as it were, and even back in the day, they even supported quite heavily integrations with on-premise systems, for example. So there's a lot of power and capability within there. That said, again, in line with the move to the cloud and the SaaS SaaS business model, allowing systems to be very, very simple in their usage and in their approach, such that people of any department, really, and of any technical expertise can have a say in how things work. Here, we also need to make a move away necessarily from continuing to use just the technical integration platform. And this is really the space where you start to see certain names like Celigo, where we're really starting to shine. It's what I've dubbed essentially the business integration platforms as a service. Now, these are platforms for integration, just as the technical ones. They allow you to provide a strategy, essentially a company-wide strategy for your integrations. That said, they have revamped how their approach is to things. It is not so much about just necessarily doing integrations. Yes, that needs to be done, and we need to follow certain industry best practices with regards to that. However, there needs to also be an element of facilitation, an element of ease of use in the truest sense, not just from a label perspective. It really needs to be straightforward to at least provide monitoring capabilities, at the very least, for all different types of audiences. Now, when I go into the platform of Celigo, you'll see where exactly and how these tend to look. Ultimately, though, just know that this tends to be where the industry is going, not just for Celigo, but for other vendors as well, where the idea is to support the entire cloud-based model first of all. So that's a SaaS first model, as you see there in the pros, having pre-built assets, i.e. avoiding reinventing the wheel if things have been done before. Let's use the native approach, which is, okay, we'll keep using that anyway. Discussing things more from a task perspective rather than an integration perspective. Again, like I said, comparing that to the technical integration platforms. Obviously, as with everything, there's always pros and cons, so there's trade-offs here. And the idea is that some elements to keep in mind is that these technical features, which these technical integration platforms do have, sometimes will be slightly less in their capabilities or in their tool set, let's say, from a business integration platform. Deployment options might also be different or less, depending on which ones and which options you're looking at. And then last, the support for what's now known as legacy or the on-prem, the really true on-prem days. Things are moving away from there anyway. Now, with that said, though, again, everything being a trade-off, it's important to consider what's the intended view for the future. After all, this is a strategy, so there will be outliers, but for the most part, the strategy needs to be able to cater for 90%, for example, if not more, of what the business need really is, still allowing a degree of flexibility to move forward. Now, I'll expand these last few points here just so you have them already on the screen. It just gives you a bit of a view from our perspective of which of these strategies have their strengths really, not only from the pros and cons, but if you were to just label them, as we've tried to do here, to get a better understanding of which one to go for, or at least what is the overarching theme for each one, you'll see there. And this is, for example, why we've labeled the DIY as the highest risk, because it really does emphasize the need for technical expertise as well as reinventing the entire setup. So a lot of thought needs to go into that. And oftentimes nowadays, that's probably not the best approach to go. In fact, not probably, it certainly isn't. It's not the best approach to go for the large majority of businesses nowadays. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It tends to be that the highest return on investment comes from the business integration platforms. And I'm certain that if you speak with anyone within this space, you'll hear the same theme. Now, with that set, and the stage has been set in this sense, I'll move on then to giving you a bit more introduction of Celigo as a company. Obviously, given the theme, we are in fact an integration platform as a service. Our view, however, for the future is for us to become the process automation platform for the mid-market. Now, what does this actually mean? This means that we're encompassing different functionalities from different areas. So things like process automation overall, think of RPA, so scraping tools that go on websites and so on, tools and desktop tools as well. But also, as we all now start to see the big trend of artificial intelligence, which has been the case for some time now, we're also incorporating that more and more so, which, by the way, we have been doing for quite some time, even before it became a trend, but ultimately incorporating that into a single platform, such that if you are, in fact, going to choose a central approach from a strategy perspective, holistically speaking, what is the company-wide strategy for integrations, then the idea being that if you do choose that, then you'll want to have the largest set or the most appropriate set of tools within your toolbox, in this case being Celigo, to allow you to do the 90%, as I was saying before, of what your business requirements might be. As it stands today, we already do the purple circle there, so the integration platform as a service. We already have capabilities for application integration. We do pre-built integrations, many of them for NetSuite as well, so it's worthwhile reaching out to us and, of course, to our partner Staria to get more details of that. As we speak, we are already in the extended integration platform, so the first outer circle there, covering things like data ingestion, API management, among other things. And for the near future, we already have plans for the broader automation platform. So definitely watch this space, watch our space to get more details of what's happening and what we release when it comes to it. All right. This brings me onto a journey. Celigo's done a journey, we are on a journey. However, today's topic is more so about looking at your customers' journey. So all the customers that you have, normally they're going through a journey with yourselves as a business. Oftentimes when I'm having conversations with e-commerce managers, with finance managers, among others, even IT directors as well, it very much becomes the case that when we start talking about it from a business perspective, we focus on those first 3 points there. If we look at discovery from the top right, and then to checkout, and then to delivery. Now, granted, that is the core flow of information and essentially core flow of business, which ultimately means that's where the automation side of things does begin. With that said, more and more so, and this is also a segue from the statistics that I was showing before in the very first slide, more and more so nowadays with the introduction of e-commerce without any other options, so because of the pandemic, ultimately a lot of emphasis was put on things such as customer services as well as on returns. And when I say emphasis in this case, it's not just being able to handle that. Obviously, that's a given. Every business needs to have that. It's about making sure that that is a smooth transition, a automated process, or at least as much as possible, allowing customers to easily continue their journey. Now, obviously, if the customer is doing a return, for example, we'll want to try and convince them not to do so, or at least to do a refund or an exchange, for example. So there are actual software as a service which have been created out of that, so just to give you some context. So the whole point here is really that while you might already have in mind and probably already done to a degree the discovery side, the checkout side, even the delivery, so you're pushing things to your logistics providers, it's worth considering how efficient are those processes, not only from a process perspective, literally the business process, but also from the underlying technology and approach for integrations, again, the strategy side. Also worth considering is what happens after that. So if you start to look at how much time and money you might be spending on handling things like returns, you might be charged fees for storage, for example. You might be charged fees for the actual payment gateway transactions back and forth. So there are certain things there that needs to be optimized, and again, automation can help with that. Returns is a necessary evil of sorts, so to speak, but certainly something which does need to be looked at, and more so in conversations that I'm having, customers are certainly focusing on that. I will take a moment here to pause and just to get David's thoughts on this as well, to understand what he might have seen with customers that he's spoken with in the recent past and or currently speaking.
Yeah, thanks, Adele. I think it's a really good use case, and I think the volume of certainly online transactions escalated heavily, as we said, through the pandemic. One of the biggest issues we see is return management, both from visibility of it coming in, where we have customers who perhaps don't have the systems to be aware it appears at the back door, and they have to try and backpedal and figure out where it relates to, and then how they manage that through quarantine and back to stock, or whether they resell or scrap those goods. So having that kind of data flow and joined up process makes that much more manageable. And that's probably a good use case to emphasize what you've been saying.
Yeah, completely agree. In fact, that reminds me of the whole RevOps model, which granted right now is more focused on SaaS and services businesses, but certainly a big topic which is now becoming more of interest for commerce and product-based businesses is really implementing a revenue operations model whereby, as Devin was saying, having full visibility into what's going on at the different stages within the customer journey, especially if the idea is, as we all know, the best customer is the one that's a recurring customer. So whether or not you are selling it on a subscription based or just selling one-off products, the idea is if you have the best way to be able to keep your customers coming back to you, that really will help to sustain the business in the long term. So certainly these are things worth keeping in mind. You're likely already seeing some of those effects and not quite understanding, or perhaps not quite sure what the issues might be or where to focus on. And that's really what we're here to help you with. And today, just to let you know that we can actually provide some, not only guidance, but certainly ideas on how best to solve this, strategy-wise, as well as then from an implementation perspective. With that said, we've looked here a little bit at the customer journey, and we did say in the agenda that we were going to look at things beyond order to cash, and that leads me on to this slide here. Now, think of this as a bird's eye view. So we're stepping quite a bit out of the weeds in this case, and what we've just seen in the previous slide, for example, could be considered the bottom right-hand corner, where you've got the direct-to-consumer sales across different sales channels, perhaps even doing still brick and mortar, so actually having stores as well. So a combination of online and direct in-person sales essentially would be what we consider omni-channel sales, really. With that said, however, naturally your business operates on different within different departments as well, of course, to be able to support the entire organization. So this is really where we talk about beyond the order to cash. So what else can we start to automate? So the first one I draw your attention to, just very briefly, these are more just ideas to keep in mind, is the customer success there on the left-hand side. The reason I touch upon that first is because if we tie it back to the previous slide that we saw, we have customer services and returns, and it's often the case that this is encompassed all within what can be considered customer success nowadays. So having a means of providing for example, a returns platform, access directly to that platform to your customers, allowing them to be able to handle the returns at least as automated as possible, with some gates obviously as required. That's essentially a very good place to start to address some of the later on the journey experiences that the customers might have, which naturally, if we talk about being able to have visibility across your organization of what's going on, you'll want to then flow into reporting and analytics, which takes us to the bottom there in the middle. We've got data warehousing and analytics. Again, another big topic for many different businesses who are wanting to start to get more than just automating the core of the business, being able to truly make intelligent decisions based on the data that's there. As we all know, business intelligence, the previous term for data warehousing and analytics and reporting, really requires insights into the data strategically to understand what's going on there. And this could be things like, of course, sales, but also, for example, returns, or which products are performing the best. A lot of this information can be gleaned from the ERP, and oftentimes it is a good starting place. However, given, again, the move to the SaaS model, a lot of cloud-based systems, being able to centralize that data is a must nowadays to make the proper decisions informed, actually knowing what's going on. So being able to bring that into a central warehouse, for example, in this case a data warehouse, putting a reporting tool on top of that is in fact a conversation that I'm starting to have more and more so, even with businesses who are not quite there yet necessarily, but already thinking about it in the future. One final thing that I'll highlight here is certainly the sales to finance one, and the reason why I want to highlight that one, it's off into direction, there we go, is just to say that while we've been speaking a lot about order to cash here in the context of essentially product selling, I did make a mention to it before, the fact that subscription businesses or services businesses are using a RevOps model. Essentially here what we'll be talking about is automation of the quote to cash process, or also known as sales to finance. So this is something that we will have a separate session on, so do keep an eye out for that in the very near future. Now then, we've done quite a bit of speaking here. What I would like to do then at this point is just show you a little bit of what the Celigo platform looks like, so you really get a feel for what's there, not just making this a slideshow, really. So on that note, I will initiate a share screen here. Okay. There we are. Okay, jumping on to here. So this is essentially what the Celigo platform looks like. Now, just as with NetSuite, for those who are in fact familiar and using NetSuite, it is a software which runs entirely on the cloud. So essentially interaction is done directly on the browser. There's nothing that needs to be installed. And essentially within Celigo, an integration is a tile. A tile can be considered a folder, for example, which might have subfolders in it. So let's look at an example. So if we talk about order management here, what I've done here is classify these different subfolders as the systems themselves, so the channels by which these orders might be coming in, for example. And then within that is where we actually have what's known as data flows, or simply just flows for short, to make it simple. Flows are essentially what bring data from one system to another and another and another. It's what actually does the automation of what would be otherwise a manual process. Now within Celigo, we've made it quite straightforward to understand. Even without looking and understanding anything from the documentation, you can immediately see, well, there we go, this is the name of the actual flow here, which by the way, you can customize as needed. You can also then see straight away when was the last time this was modified. Quite helpful to see if there's any problem with this flow, perhaps because someone modified it not long ago. Also, if there are any errors in the flow, when it was last executed, and most important of all, is it on or not? And that might seem a bit silly, but oftentimes if a flow is, if data is not flowing in the right direction, it could be that accidentally the flow has been switched off by someone. Maybe they were testing something. It happens more often than not. So it's also very important to be able to understand at a glance essentially what's going on there. Now, if we jump into one of these just to see what this looks like, ultimately, I'll expand the whole thing so you can see what's there and see it in a full view. This is a series of steps, the same steps that you would otherwise do manually, as I said before. That's essentially what we're automating here. And each step is what's known as a bubble in Celigo. In this case here, we're just exporting orders from Amazon as a marketplace in this case. Due to the requirements that Amazon has, we then go separately to get the actual items of each of those orders. Subsequently, if need be, we create the customer in NetSuite, and then last, but certainly not least, creating the sales order. Now, this would be in the context of a order which would be fulfilled by yourselves. We can also, of course, automate it when it comes to fulfilled by the marketplace, FBA as known by Amazon, but certainly other marketplaces have the same thing. So the idea being here, as I say, to automate these different steps as they are required. Now, of course, in doing so, one of the most important things to have the flexibility to do is to make decisions. So, for example, adding in a decision on which 3PL, which logistics provider, needs to actually fulfill the order. So if we take a step back, and I'll show you a different process where that's going to look like. However, you'll see it looks very, very familiar, very similar. On the logistics side of things, if we now go over to this flow here, which now takes that previously created sales order, we're going to then decide, based on a few parameters, which provider we're going to be sending that to. And you can now see that you essentially have what's known in Celigo side as a branched flow. It makes a decision based on a parameter, in this case, based on the delivery partner that's coming from NetSuite in this case. We'll then decide which of the three, could be more, could be less. It could be that you have a completely separate provider for making the decision. That's not a problem as well. So essentially here, just offering you a way to add in some business logic into the flow at a glance to figure out which of the three providers this is being sent to, then naturally writing that information back to NetSuite. So this is illustrating the fact that these flows, while they are automating a process, which normally would be thought of as, well, it's only one way. Yes, but there are things which need to be sent back in the opposite direction. So in this case here, we're creating the shipment information with, for example, the tracking data directly in NetSuite, which could in turn be sent to your sales channel. And likewise, if you're doing sales as a point of sale, so physical location, it'll be a similar fashion that you'll be doing that as well. Okay. Now, on from that, this isn't all of it just about building things. Note that Celigo does have capabilities in the form of dashboarding, so you can see how these flows are actually performing, both currently as well as historical performances. You can even have a look at analytics as well. This is where I say that we're making the platform much more user-friendly, or I'd like to call it business person-friendly, as opposed to making it very, very technical. Again, to be able to analyze things much more deeply than just understanding, well, it's an integration, it's a black box, we don't really need to understand what's going on. Quite the contrary here, we want people to understand what's going on there. Even in some cases, I even like to call this the operational dashboard. So it's one of the few systems that will allow you to see the overall health, if you like, of how the business is from a technical/functional perspective. Now, in the interest of time, keeping this very, very short and brief here. However, I do encourage you to reach out to Celigo and our partner here, Staria, to get much more information about how this can really benefit you as a business. What can we do to help you automate the different processes that you have within your organization? Now, with that, I shall share screen back to our presentation. And there we are. Right then, as we're approaching here the end, imagine that, it's already been quite some time. It's all fun here in our conversations. I do just want to give you some comfort in who we are here as a Celigo. So I've explained what we do. I've given you a brief glimpse into the platform itself and what the different elements might look like. It's just really tip of the iceberg. However, I also want to provide you with the context of who Celigo is as a company. So we are a company operating globally. We do have our HQ in the United States. In terms of business processes, or the amount of information going back and forth within the platform, you'll see there one of the interesting stats being 16 billion records processed in a month. Now, one of my colleagues from the sales likes to say, that's a bit meaningless unless there's some context. And really, that is true. The context here being that you'll see that particular stat is explaining how much information has gone through Celigo on a particular month in this case, and just to know as some context, we didn't actually have any failures during that time, meaning that we were supporting several businesses, some logos of which you'll see there on the left hand side, and some of these are quite big, and they have a lot of orders in this case that they are processing, and they really do have their timelines to meet when it comes to delivering these orders. So we really did manage to make sure that their businesses were effectively supported throughout any given month. So much so that if we take a normal busy period for many businesses, as we know, Black Friday, which is not far off, we actually see half of that number in a 3-day period. So again, just to give you some context as to how much volume we can process as a business, quite important to know, because if we are the backbone of your organization, to automate your different business processes, one of the things we do really need to ensure that we have is scalability. And really, this is meant to illustrate exactly that. However, don't take my word for it only. I do strongly encourage you to have a look at least the 2 logos there at the bottom. So Gartner Peer Insights, these are insights and reviews written by customers, in this case Celigo customers, of Celigo itself, so you can hear what and see what they are saying about us. And likewise on G2, which, if you might not be aware, is a website which does a comparison of many different softwares in different categories. We have actually been rated the #1 integration platform as a service in the spring and also in the summer for this year. So I do strongly encourage having a look there to get a different view and opinion, of course, of what our customers say and think of Celigo. Now, last but certainly not least, I would like to encourage you to reach out again, once again, as I said. So in this case, if you're reaching out directly to Staria, you've got David's email address there on screen. And just to note as well, there will be an event at the end of this month, so October, where there will be present in Helsinki, as you'll see there. You've got the details. I encourage you to scan the QR code there, get more details of that, and of course to come along to have a chat with us in person, both with Celigo and of course with the Staria team as well. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I'll hand over to David for some final words of wisdom.
No, fantastic, Adele. Great presentation. Really appreciate it. I think my final words are around not underestimating the value of putting data in the correct place for the various roles within your organization. So if you're using a CRM, you probably don't want them guys or sales guys in your finance system. But there might be certain data that wants to exchange. The same with visibility on returns created in a commerce site or renewal management. So the use cases are almost infinite, but we see for sensible use of data, not having to have excessive users in multiple systems to gain those insights that are really important, and then harvesting that data back out into a sensible view. Maybe it's a multi-entity NetSuite instance for projects or services or finance, and how we then collate that data outside of a standard ERP and introduce CRM data, ERP data, services data, warehouse data. So you can start to get really sensible and multi-dimensional reporting that makes sense to the operational side of the business. But no, as Adele said, please, if anybody would like to come and meet a number of members of both our team and our partners, including Celigo, please do register. We'd be delighted to have you. Any queries or questions, please contact myself or your contact point at Staria. But a fantastic session. Look forward to the next one, Adele. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and we'll speak soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.